Greetings, folks, and welcome back to another edition of History Up Close. My name is Sterling Gillum, and I'm your museum director, and we're thrilled to bring you this series sponsored by the Naval Aviation Museum Foundation. Today, we'd also like to welcome Hellcat Productions, who will assist us in presenting this series. Hellcat is a top shelf production company, and they're going to make this series even better. And it's only appropriate we bring them aboard today because today's feature, wait for it, is the F6F Hellcat. Really excited about it. It's one of our favorite airplanes in the museum, certainly for its phenomenal record in World War II in combat, but also for the large number of wonderful naval aviators that flew this airplane throughout his career, not the least of which is our own Dick Pace, naval aviator, World War II veteran. Dick Pace has been a longtime volunteer at the National Naval Aviation Museum, and he just turned 100 last summer. He still frequents the museum regularly, sporting his volunteer badge, and we're really thrilled to tell the story of his airplane. We have with us today Hill Goodspeed, our historian. Hill literally grew up in this museum, and he's forgotten more about naval aviation than I'll ever know, and he'll walk you through this rich history of the F6F Hellcat. Hill, take it away.
Everybody out there in Facebook land tuning in and hearing the story about the F6F Hellcat. Now, before I get to the aircraft itself, I'm going to look at a little bit of the history of what it accomplished. And there's no better way than to take a look at this scoreboard behind me. This is the hangar deck scoreboard from the USS Hornet, and it was used to document the ship's combat actions during World War II. And you notice all the Japanese battle flags up there. You'll also notice some statistics. Numbers of planes shot down. And all of those planes shot down, every single one of them, was the result of the actions of an F6F Hellcat. Now expand upon this particular scoreboard even further in that whenever the fleet put to sea when the Hellcat was aboard, generally there were 16 carriers in the task force, and each one of the carriers had a scoreboard very similar to this one. So that gives you a perspective on what the F6F accomplished. And interestingly, one of the pilots who shot down some of the aircraft here was a guy named Lieutenant Commander Marshall Beebe. And Marsh Beebe went on to serve in the Navy, spend the whole career in the Navy, and he retired as a captain. And later on, he was the air group commander on board the USS Essex during the Korean War. And one of the individuals he flew with was a young ensign by the name of Neil Armstrong. And USS It was the same ship that picked up Armstrong and his fellow astronauts when they returned from their first lunar mission in July of 1969. But now we'll go ahead and take a look at the actual aircraft. This is an F6F3 version of the Hellcat. The museum actually also has an F6F5 version, which is on display on our mezzanine level. But this is a aircraft that's built by Grumman, and if you tuned in last week, you saw General Thiessen speak about the F4F Wildcat, which was the predecessor to this one. Now, when the F4F Wildcat was in service, it had some deficiencies compared to the Japanese Zero. And so the Navy really wanted to bring aircraft into the fleet that could counter the Japanese Zero's capabilities. And they turned to Grumman, and they also had turned to Vought aircraft company, and they developed a couple of different aircraft. One of them was the F4U Corsair, and Grumman developed this one, the F6F Hellcat. And so it has a number of differences than the Wildcat, because as one pilot requested after flying the Wildcat, he said, we want something that will go upstairs quickly. And that means it would have great speed and the ability to climb at a rapid rate. And what enabled it to do that was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine it has here. It's 2,000 horsepower. And that enabled the aircraft to fly at around 380 miles per hour maximum speed, and also climb at 3,500 feet per minute. So that enabled Hellcat pilots to counter the Japanese Zero's capabilities. One thing the Hellcat would not still do with the Zero in combat was get into slow speed turns with the Zero, because the Zero was still generally superior in that. But in all other aspects, the Hellcat was an incredible platform in which to defeat the Japanese Zero. And just to show you how good it was, it entered combat in August of 1943, served throughout World War II, and shot down over 5,000 enemy aircraft. And it had a 19-to-1 kill ratio, which means that for every 19 aircraft the Hellcat shot down, only one Hellcat was shot down in air-to-air combat. And what enabled it to do that, even though they're not really depicted here, but you got 50 caliber machine guns. These are the holes where 6 50 calibers would be, 3 on this wing and 3 on the other wing. And that was the firepower of the Hellcat. What's different from the Hellcat as compared to the Wildcat you saw last week was the Wildcat's landing gear were in the fuselage right there in the center, really tucked right into there. And the pilot had to actually crank the landing gear up himself. Well, when people got into Hellcat, they were very thankful that they did not have to do that. There was a hydraulic switch and the landing gear came up on its own, which really benefited Hellcat pilots compared to Wildcat pilots. We have our example of the F6F on a catapult here. And aircraft carriers were equipped with catapults in World War II, but if there was enough room on the flight deck and you could pack the aircraft far to the rear or aft on the flight deck, you really didn't need a catapult to launch some of the aircraft. In situations where they didn't have enough deck space, the catapult was used. And the Hellcat used a bridle catapult system. So here you'll see 2 hooks, one underneath the port wing, one underneath the starboard wing, and those would attach down to a shuttle. And on the rear of the aircraft, there would be a bar, which would have a hold-back tension device. And what that would enable it to do is when the Hellcat hooked onto the catapult and revved up to full power, that holdback bar would keep the aircraft from actually launching as it revved up the engine or actually taking off. And then what they would do is they would fire the catapult once it reached full speed. And when they fired the catapult, it would put enough pressure on that holdback link to break it. And off the aircraft went. There was a shuttle stopper at the end, or a bridle stopper. So when the aircraft reached the end of the flight deck and took off, these hooks there, the bridle would actually fall off the aircraft, and there would be something at the end of the catapult track so it wouldn't go over the front of the aircraft carrier. But as I said, the Hellcat did not need to catapult frequently, but when it did, they would use these hydraulic catapults. And one unique thing about the Hellcat was actually on some of the early Essex class carriers, there was a hangar deck catapult. Actually would swing out over the side of the ship, and from the hangar deck, which is below the flight deck, could either be launched from there. And they never used that operationally, really. They experimented with it, but that would have been definitely quite a ride. And initially, as I said, the Hellcat featured the 50 caliber machine guns, but it could do it could carry a lot more ordnance as the aircraft developed. Eventually, it could carry a bomb underneath a station beneath one of the wings. And also, in some of the later versions, they would have racks, which are positioned on the underside. And on those racks would be 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets. Because what the Navy quickly realized with the Hellcat was it had an aircraft that was capable of not only dominating the enemy in the air, also very capable of delivering devastating strikes on the ground. And so if you look now in the modern F/A-18 Super Hornets, they're called strike fighters, which means that they can engage the enemy in air-to-air combat, and they can also deliver devastating firepower on ground targets. Well, that's what the Hellcat developed into during the course of World War II, especially during the latter part of the war when kamikaze aircraft were attacking the fleet. The Hellcat was an aircraft that could engage them and also just devastate enemy airfields and other targets at very low level. Which meant when they were attacking at low level, they had to endure a lot of enemy ground fire. And that was one of the hallmarks of naval aviation combat actions. There weren't high altitude bombers where you dropped from thousands of feet in the air. The attacks these things made against low level targets, you were really low. So you were subject to ground fire. But luckily, Grumman was known for building aircraft that were extremely rugged. John McCain, Admiral John McCain, Senator McCain's grandfather, was the chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, and he once said that having the name Grumman on an aircraft was like having sterling on silver, because that's how good Grumman aircraft were, and they could take a lot of punishment. That's because they had armor situated in the various locations on the aircraft. There would be armor plate to protect the engine areas and the fuel tank, and there was armor around the pilot's cockpit area. And it also had an armored cockpit windscreen. And one example of how effective that was, there was an aviator named Charles Cromlin, Commander Charles Cromlin, who was an air group commander on board the USS Yorktown. And on November 21st, 1943, he was making a low-level attack, and he took an enemy anti-aircraft round right in the front of his cockpit, which shattered the glass all around him. And but it didn't actually puncture to where the round came in to hit him. He had shards of glass come at him. It cut him in various places. It got near his eye, so blood was dripping down his face. It also broke one of his wrists. And so here he is in this Hellcat. The engine is still running, although he had to work with it to make sure it kept functioning. And here he is, despite being virtually blinded, he flew 100 miles from where he was hit to make a carrier landing back on board the USS Yorktown. And he had lost so much blood that he was weak, and he couldn't really even get out of the cockpit by himself. He had to be helped out of the cockpit. But that was an example of how rugged this aircraft was and how it could bring a pilot back, even if his aircraft had been damaged considerably. Now let's look around this side of the aircraft, and I'm going to tell you about this specific one. This one, even though we have it on our replica of the USS Cabot flight deck, really never flew from an aircraft carrier in combat. It was actually one part of a land-based squadron, VF-38, which operated in the Solomon Islands in 1943 and 1944. And that squadron had 22 air-to-air kills, or combat victories over Japanese aircraft, and flew over various targets like Rabaul and other targets in the Solomon Islands. And so it is a combat veteran, and that's pretty unique. A lot of people think of all the aircraft that were built in World War II, there have to be more combat veterans. For example, the Hellcat, they built 12,275 of these aircraft. And it was said that at peak production, Grumman turned out one of these every hour around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So you would think that some surviving number of those aircraft that are with us today would be combat veterans. But to have a combat veteran is very rare. And so that makes this aircraft really unique. How did we get it? Well, it was recovered from the bottom of Lake Michigan. Like a number of our World War II aircraft, after its combat days were over, it was sent to NAS Glenview, Illinois. And that's where the Navy had its carrier qualification training unit. And this particular aircraft, in January of 1945, was flown by a lieutenant junior grade named Walter Elcott. And he was making his landing on the USS Sable. And as he was coming in, he sort of aircraft pitched to one side, hit the deck at a funny angle, went over the side, and actually hung up on the catwalk on the ship for a brief period of time as the ship was underway, eventually dropped off into the water and started to sink. Elcock had been through water survival training, so as the aircraft was sinking, he unstrapped, and he was 10 feet underwater when he finally freed himself and he swam to the surface. And the aircraft was heavily damaged in that. It lost part of its tail, some of its wing broke off, and it sat on the bottom of Lake Michigan until the early 2000s when we recovered it, went through extensive restoration. And what our restoration crew does, and it's a very talented group of individuals, they seek, when they can, to preserve some of the aircraft's original markings and original paint. And at that time, when this aircraft was operational, for a very brief moment in time, the national insignia had a red circle around it. And here you can see the remnants of that red paint. So this is original World War II era paint. So it's always neat for our visitors to come and see not only the restored aircraft, which takes thousands of hours to put back together, but to see that link to what it actually looked like at one point. Now, the Hellcat has tremendous number of personal stories. There are numerous pilots who flew it to great fame, including David McCampbell, who was a Medal of Honor recipient and the leading Navy ace of World War II. He had 34 kills. That's 34 enemy aircraft that he shot down. Another Medal of Honor recipient named Butch O'Hare. He received the Medal of Honor for his actions in the F6F Wildcat, but he later on flew the Hellcat during some of the earliest night fighter experimentation in combat. And tragically, he was shot down during those instances and killed in action, but he was the one that led the F6F's efforts to become a night fighter, which it eventually became a very capable one. So I'll tell you a few personal stories about the aircraft. The first individual I'm going to talk about is a guy named Lieutenant Commander Robert Price. And I'm going to grab something over here real quick. Lieutenant Commander Price was a squadron commander in VF-25, which was flying from an aircraft carrier called the USS Cowpens. And in June of 1944, he was making a low-level strafing attack against Japanese shipping. He made the attack, and he started to pull up, and he felt a thump on his aircraft, and he had been hit. And then he looked at his oil pressure gauge, and it started to do things it's not supposed to, and before you know it, the engine stopped. And Price had enough altitude where he could make a nice controlled landing, which he did, and then he was trying to get his life raft out of the cockpit as he was sinking beneath the surface of the Pacific. He tried and tried and tried, but he could not get his life raft out, so he had to abandon the aircraft, swim to the surface, and there he is floating around in his life raft, or with his Mae West life vest. That's all he had. So there he is, floating around in the Pacific. And the next thing you know, he sees an auxiliary fuel tank. And you can see one of them right behind me, or right in front of me. The camera will point to it on that wall there. There is a auxiliary fuel tank which was carried underneath the fuselage there. And so, as he's floating with his Mae West life vest, he all of a sudden sees this fuel tank come to the surface. And what had happened was, as the aircraft sank, the fuel tank became detached, and up to the surface it went. And here he is swimming. He doesn't have any flotation device other than his life vest, and he swims over to the fuel tank, and he grabs onto it, thinking it's going to just keep him afloat, help keep him afloat. Next thing you know, a Japanese destroyer comes nearby. It approaches to within 75 yards of him, and he hides behind this fuel tank. And luckily, they don't see him, and he's able to avoid what would have been certain capture. But now he's in the water. Again, all he has is his life vest, and a squadron mate in a Hellcat just like this flies over and drops a life raft to him. And in that life raft is a note saying, "We'll be back to get you tomorrow," and one of these, 1 can of fresh drinking water. So Price climbs into the life raft and thinking he's going to have one night to float in the Pacific and then all will be good the next day. Well, what happens is his squadron mates fly over the next day with a float plane, and they can't see him. It's a small, finding a raft in the vast Pacific is a very difficult thing to see from altitude, and they just completely missed him, even though he fired off some of his flares from his flare gun. So now he's in a raft, again, with just this. So what he does over the course of the next few days, he tries to protect himself from the sun as much as possible, kills a seagull and eats that, and then later said that it was terrible to eat and made him thirstier. And he actually managed to eat a couple of fish that sharks that were circling his raft managed to literally scare into his raft, and he killed them and ate them. As far as drinking water, all he had to rely upon and hope for was that rain would pass over, rainstorms would pass over, and drop fresh water on him that he could catch and drink. But unfortunately, day after day, the rain did not fall. So he was very, very disciplined. As he was in his raft every night, if no rain fell, which none did, he would allot himself 1 sip out of this can. And that was it. It took incredible self-discipline to do that. Days go by, and finally, no more sips left. And he's starting to get pretty concerned that this may be the end for him. Luckily for him, there had been an air battle after he had been shot down. It was a battle called the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and there was an air action called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where Hellcats like this shot down scores of Japanese aircraft. And during that battle, a number of aircraft went into the water. And so U.S. ships were intensifying their search, and they happened upon Commander Price. During 11 days in his life raft, he lost 28 pounds. But it was his fortitude and his determination kept him alive. And that's one example of a Hellcat pilot who flew this aircraft. Another one is a gentleman who worked here for a time. His name's Captain Ray Hawkins. He was a lieutenant, junior grade lieutenant in World War II. And to tell you a little bit about Ray Hawkins, what kind of individual he was, and the types of individuals who flew in that very cockpit there, He shot down 14 Japanese aircraft, which means those flags right there, he would have had 14 on his aircraft. He helped sink a Japanese battleship, and he received 3 Navy Crosses, which is an award right below the Medal of Honor. And ladies and gentlemen, he did that all before he was 21 years old. So that's an amazing testament to the individuals who were called upon to defend our country more than 75 years ago. Well, I'm going to tell you about a mission, Hawkins Flu, where he didn't fire a single shot. Many of you may have seen the movie or read the book Unbroken, which is about an Olympic runner named Louis Zamperini. And Zamperini joins the Army Air Forces after the U.S. Enters World War II, and he's a crewman on a B-24 Liberator. And the aircraft has to make a forced landing in the Pacific. And only 3 men on the aircraft get out. They float around the Pacific. 1 actually passes away during the course of their ordeal. And then the surviving 2, including Louis Zamperini, are captured by the Japanese. And then they're held in a prisoner of war camp in Japan for months at a time. And then the atomic bombs are detonated over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And as the book Unbroken points out, and you see in the movie, the POWs are marched down to a lakefront where the POW camp is. And their guards tell them what has happened, the war is over, and the guards leave. And so here are these POWs. Remember, as a POW, your existence is totally orchestrated. You don't move without being given permission to do so. And here they are trying to figure out what has actually gone on. And in the movie, as Hollywood does so well, they look over the lakefront and they see this aircraft approach, and it flies over, and they look and they see the stars and bars like on this aircraft, and they say the war is over. And in the movie, it's a P-51 Mustang, but in reality, it was an F6F Hellcat flown by Lieutenant Arthur Ray Hawkins, the aviator I just told you about. And what he was doing was flying over, looking for POW camps so that he and other aircraft could drop supplies to them. But unfortunately, the aircraft with all the supplies that Hawkins was flying with experienced some problems with weather, and they couldn't get through to the POW camps. So Lieutenant Hawkins dropped a message to the POWs on the ground, and it says, "I'll lead planes back tomorrow," puts his name on there. And then Lieutenant Hawkins drops to the POWs what he has in his own survival kit, which was a candy bar that he had taken a bite out of, and a pack of cigarettes, and he'd smoked one of them. So he drops that to them in a message bag. And on the surface, you probably think that may have been pretty cruel to drop men who are literally starving a partially eaten candy bar and a pack of cigarettes where it's not even full. But what those POWs did, they took that candy bar and they chopped it up into ant-sized pieces. And each POW who wanted to get a piece of chocolate could walk up and lick his finger and get a piece of chocolate for the first time in a long time. And as far as the smokers in the camp, they formed 19 circles, and each circle got 1 cigarette, and they took turns taking a puff. And the true impact of what he did that day, you don't really realize it until 40 some odd years later. And what happened was Captain Hawkins, working right here in this museum, got a phone call from a guy in Australia who said he wanted to come visit him. And this gentleman copped on a plane, flew all the way from Australia to Pensacola, Florida, for one express purpose. And that purpose was to hand deliver the handwritten note that Hawkins had written back in August of 1945 and return it to the pilot who had dropped it to him as a POW. So that is the impact of what Hellcat pilots did. Now, the Hellcat had a very distinguished career in World War II, but what is unique about it is if you look at combat aircraft today, they serve for decades at a time, namely because they're very expensive. The Hellcat's heyday existed from essentially August of 1943 to the end of 1945 when World War II ended. And after that, its career was, it quickly faded from the scene. You had early jets coming on the scene, and technology was changing. And what's ironic about the Hellcat, even though it served with the Blue Angels after the war, had a starring role in that. It was the first aircraft flown by the Blue Angels. One element of the Hellcat story, which is very ironic, is it ended its career in the 1950s as a target drone. It would be remotely flown, and other Navy aircraft would shoot it down and test missile systems and what have you. So it wasn't a real fitting end for an aircraft that really made its great impact on naval aviation, indeed all of World War II, by shooting down so many aircraft to end in a way where it was the one getting shot down. But it is truly one of the legendary fighters in naval aviation history and U.S. Military history. And I hope you've enjoyed taking a quick look at the aircraft and those amazing individuals who flew it into history during World War II. So I'll be happy to take any questions you might have.
So we do have some questions. Gene says, what year was this F6F recovered from Lake Michigan?
I believe this one was recovered in 2009, and it took a number of years to restore to its display condition right now.
Along the same lines, someone says, why the number 21? Was it the 21st plane made?
It was not the 21st aircraft made. It is actually painted in the markings of the individual who sponsored the aircraft's recovery and actual restoration display. And that individual is a guy named Jack Taylor. And Jack Taylor was a World War II fighter pilot. And he's been a great benefactor of the museum foundation, supporting various things that we've done here at the museum. And the thing about Jack Taylor was he made a name for himself and also became very successful as the owner of a rent-a-car business. And in honor of his World War II service, he named it Enterprise Rent-a-Car. So these markings actually depict an aircraft that Jack Taylor flew off the USS Enterprise in World War II.
Dave says, in the development of the F6F Hellcat, was there ever a reason given officially why the Navy turned down the XF-5F skyrocket that Grumman designed before it?
Well, XF-5F was a twin-engine aircraft. And the reason it was turned down really was, even though it was put into production before the Hellcat behind me, it was a twin-engine design. The Navy was always looking for more speed. If you talk to any fighter pilot, speed is life, is an old saying. And so they were always looking to have as much speed as possible for aircraft that were operational in the fleet. And the XF-5F1 was one of those first twin-engine fighters that the Navy experimented with. But it had some developmental problems. It was relatively new. And what happened was you had an aircraft like the F4U Corsair, which we will probably cover in a later history up close, which could fly faster than 400 miles an hour and was very capable and was ready to go. And so when you're in the midst of combat, you will quickly put aside aircraft that don't hold as much promise as other ones that are coming on the scene, and the XF-5F1 faded into history.
So Hill, we got someone that says, have you ever flown a Hellcat?
I have not. I don't fly. The main thing I've flown is an airliner every now and then, so I'm not an actual pilot, but have had the chance to go out aboard a carrier a few times and ride in a COD, carrier onboard delivery, so that was quite an experience. But no, I am not a pilot and don't have any time behind the controls.
So John says, given the multi-role attack capabilities that you mentioned, why did the Hellcat disappear from active Navy inventory so quickly after World War II, as compared to the Corsair that was still being used for ground support in Korea?
Well, the Corsair, they determined that the Corsair was going to be, what kept the Corsair off carriers in World War II initially was it had some problems landing aboard ship. And so I won't go into what the details were, but it had some initial issues that kept it from carriers. But once it was able to operate from carriers, it proved itself to be a very versatile platform. It was faster than the Hellcat, and also one reason was that during World War II there was another aircraft developed called the AD Skyraider, which became an even more capable ground attack aircraft. So it was just, the F4F was determined to be a better fit going into the modern, the post-World War II period. And then of course, as far as fighters are concerned, you start to see jets make their appearance, especially in the Korean Wars when they were introduced to combat. And then propeller-driven attack aircraft, they were seeing their days numbered as the jets started to develop.
Nathan says, do you think Japanese pilots were surprised when the Hellcat came on the scene?
Well, I'm sure the Japanese, just like the United States during World War II, when you're fighting in combat and when you have a war going on, you're trying to advance technology as quickly as possible. And certainly the Japanese were doing that just along with the United States. But until you see an aircraft in air-to-air combat and experience what its capabilities were, I'm certain the first Japanese pilots were probably surprised by the capabilities, because if you look at the Hellcat and if you remember the Wildcat, they do bear a family resemblance. You can tell they came from the same company. So there probably was some surprise, but I'm sure then they started to try to figure out how to beat it, which turned out to be a losing proposition.
Are there any Hellcats that are operational today?
I believe there are some that are flyable today. There's only a handful of them around. They didn't survive in as great a numbers as some other types of aircraft, but there are some that are operational today.
So we've got time for one more, and it comes from Steve, who says, who is the highest scoring Hellcat ace?
The highest scoring ace was a guy named David McCampbell. He had 34 kills, and that makes him the leading Navy ace of all time, and he was a Medal of Honor recipient. So that being the last question, I'd like to thank you today for joining us for History Up Close, which is sponsored graciously by the Naval Aviation Museum Foundation. And I want to introduce who's going to be part of the next History Up Close, which is one of our dedicated tour guides named Bob Thomas, retired airline pilot, but before he got into the airline business, he was the pilot of an A-7 Corsair II, the famous Slough. And he is going to be giving a presentation same time, 11 o'clock Central Time on Thursday, talking about his experiences in the A-7, which included time off Vietnam during the evacuation of Saigon in 1975. So please join Bob. He's an expert on what it was like to fly the A-7. And thank you for joining us today, and hope you have a great day. Thank you, everybody.